celebrate the Russian Revolution in Moscow's Red Square, no one mentions the man who once turned the Red Army from a rabble into a disciplined fighting force. For more than 50 years, he was an unperson. No Soviet leader could speak his name.
Trotsky and the Trotskyists denied the possibility of building socialism in conditions of capitalist encirclement.
Yet the time was when many in the Soviet Communist Party thought of him as the natural successor to Lenin. Such was the political stature of the man who called himself Leon Trotsky. Trotsky's life ended tragically at the age of 61 in a house on the outskirts of Mexico City in 1940, when Stalin finally caught up with him. In the last years, he had wandered from place to place, searching for sanctuary, but still sustaining a bitter feud with Stalin in Moscow, to whom he had lost the struggle for power. Trotsky, along with Lenin, made the revolution of October 1917. In the prelude to that explosion, he played his part in many demonstrations, meetings, and assemblies. As a revolutionary, Trotsky's most vital task was to be a popular orator. He was constantly arguing, convincing, and inspiring the crowds into action. For Trotsky, political debate was all important. He preferred the use of argument to the use of force. One of his political comrades nicknamed him the Pen. Trotsky, working closely with Lenin, was the voice of the revolution. Trotsky was his assumed name. He was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein in the Ukrainian village of Yanovka on October the 26th, 1879. He was the fifth child of well-to-do farmers. A bright, intense boy, he won a place at the University of Odessa. He became indignant at the sufferings of the poor peasants and workers in the feudal empire of Tsar Nicholas II. He joined a secret revolutionary movement which had formed among the young intellectuals of the time. They began to organize protests. Their secret group was discovered by the authorities. Trotsky was arrested. But in jail, he met other revolutionaries. Among them was Alexandra Sokolovskaya, who introduced him to Marxism. She and Trotsky were married in a Moscow prison cell en route to Siberian exile. There they had two daughters, Zina and Nina. But Trotsky escaped, leaving wife and daughters behind. His aim was to join other Marxist revolutionaries outside Russia. He arrived in London, where he found Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, the editor of the newspaper Iskra, the Spark. Lenin was the future theoretician of the Marxist revolution and had already written What is to be Done, which was the basis of the future Bolshevik Party's organization and action. At dawn on October the 20th, 1902, Lenin was woken by Trotsky, who was 10 years his junior.
As regards Lenin, he was a model for Trotsky. It's to join him that he leads. And Trotsky is for Lenin the talented young militant. The first contact is very good and very fast. After the Second Congress, everything changes. At this Second Congress, Lenin and Trotsky diverge on the question of leadership, of the composition of the leadership and the elimination of the old guard, which Trotsky doesn't accept. From this moment, there are Bolsheviks, meaning the majority with Lenin, and the Menshevik minority, to which Trotsky belongs for some time. And they are fundamentally divided over the question, will the working class lead the revolution? The Bolsheviks say yes, The Mensheviks say no. How is the party going to be made? By uniting all the tendencies, all the currents, says Trotsky. Beginning by forming a rigid and disciplined party, says Lenin. And the two men, separated by these questions, argue vigorously and are opposed for a good 10 years before joining forces. But that was still to come.
Some months later, Trotsky went to Paris, and there he met the woman who was to become his second wife and lifelong companion, Natalia Sidova.
C'était un être très frêle.
She was a very frail girl, but gifted with a personality that one reacted to, one perceived immediately. She was extremely kind to everyone around here, very attentive, very subtle, very sensitive. But of course, she was a militant before she met Trotsky. She was in Paris in this group. She got herself kicked out of university at a young age and went to continue her studies in botany at Geneva. Then she came to Paris to strengthen the Iskra group, and that's when she met Trotsky. So she always considered herself a militant in her own right.
But soon, great events drew Trotsky back to his homeland. In a starving Russia, whose fleet had just suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Japanese, demonstrations against the Tsar erupted in January 1905. Trotsky secretly returned to St. Petersburg. He was the first, and for some months, the only revolutionary leader back from exile. The Russian Empire was in revolt. The Tsar was forced to concede certain democratic liberties and the Constitution. The 1905 revolution put the name of Trotsky on everybody's lips. At 26, he became president of the Petersburg Soviet and was in charge of organizing the strike and armed revolt. In December, he was arrested with his associates and deported for life to Siberia. In 1907, he escaped once more and headed for Central Europe. For the next 7 years, from a base in Vienna, he frequented revolutionary circles in Austria, Germany, and France. He founded a newspaper in Vienna and argued against Lenin and the Bolshevik position. He tried to organize the workers, many of whom were making munitions and armaments. When war broke out in 1914, he moved to Paris with Natalia and their two sons, Lyova and Sergei. Like many others engaged in revolutionary politics, he was convinced that the war would release the forces of world revolution. News of the February Revolution, which reached him in New York, brought Trotsky hurrying back to Russia. He arrived via Finland on May the 4th, 1917. The Tsar had abdicated under the pressure of a people no longer willing to fight the war. Trotsky renounced his disagreement with Lenin and joined him to fight the provisional government of Kerensky and to direct the proletarian revolution. The Menshevik had become a Bolshevik.
Trotsky n'était pas un vieux Bolshevik.
Trotsky was not an old Bolshevik. It's the first point, and it's very, very important. He joined the Bolshevik movement and Lenin at the outbreak of the revolution. He played an extraordinary role in some absolutely crucial sectors of the insurrection. And of course, afterwards, in constructing the Red Army. But to begin with, he wasn't part of it. One must never forget that, because it explains a certain behavior, certain attitudes, a certain distance in his relations. He had become, in a certain sense, Lenin's second in command. although at the time things were not so formal. No one would have dared to say at the time that he was Lenin's second in command.
Personne n'aurait osé dire à cette époque.
All the People's Commissars were Bolsheviks. The new leaders were young men. Bukharin was 29. Kamenev and Zinoviev were 34. Trotsky, at Foreign Affairs, was joined by his old friends from exile, Yoffe and Rakovsky. The man appointed to be Commissar for Nationalities was a Georgian named Djugashvili, better known as Stalin. Well before Stalin obtained supreme power, the issue of democracy arose in the young Soviet Republic.
One mustn't forget one thing even so, that Russia, I speak in the traditional sense of the term, the Russia of the Tsars and also Bolshevik Russia since Lenin, in the whole of its history knew only 7 months during which there was any mention of democracy. It was from February 1917 to October 1917. And Lenin came into office bluntly declaring, we don't want any democracy, we don't need it, and there won't be any. And besides, the first thing he did was to abolish the Constituent Assembly, which had just been elected, and in which he didn't have the majority, far from it. He only had 25% of all votes, while the Socialist Revolutionaries, the largest traditional party in Russia, had more than 60% of the vote.
Soon, the Soviet Republic had only one party and one press. For Lenin and for Trotsky, the only way to bring about socialism was through the dictatorship of the proletariat, using the methods of democratic centralism guided by the Bolshevik Party. From the outset, there were violent outbreaks of resistance to this view of revolution. The continuing war had the effect of toning down the internal opposition, but it did not go away. At the front, millions of soldiers of the former Tsar's army had been locked in combat with the German armies since 1914. They had been beaten in battle, were often barefoot, ill-equipped and hungry. Tens of thousands deserted, and fraternization between Russians and Germans was frequent. There was disagreement among the Bolsheviks about whether to continue the war in order to bring about revolution in Germany, or to keep their promise of bringing peace to Russia. Trotsky's compromise was to negotiate for peace and to delay signing. This delaying tactic was carried in the Central Committee. The new Soviet Union soon had other problems. White Russian armies intent on restoring the Tsarist regime attacked the Bolsheviks. Civil war erupted, threatening the revolution. It lasted 30 long months. The victorious Allied armies, the British, the Japanese and the Americans, intervened on the side of the White Russians in an attempt to crush the young republic. Leon Trotsky was appointed War Commissar. He turned out to have extraordinary abilities as an organizer. He recruited and equipped a new Red Army. In May of 1918, it had consisted of 300,000 demoralized troops. By December 1920, it was an army of 5 million. Trotsky proved to be an outstanding military leader. Although his only experience of war had been street fighting and popular protest, he became a brilliant strategist, combining conventional and guerrilla warfare. His force consisted of mobile units and his ability to inspire his fighting troops into action. His mobile headquarters were an armored train. It was the center of command, of propaganda and communications. It carried a radio, a printing press, a cinema, a hospital, and shock troops. Trotsky lived permanently on the railway, scouring the country in every direction to support the Red Army.
Every time that the whites capture a territory, an industrial city, they kill all the communists. They massacre them. And if the Red Army recaptures this region or this city, the party has to be revived. Well, it can't be revived with the people who have been killed there. They must be brought in from elsewhere. And to bring in communists, for example, in Siberia, a central organization which appoints and selects them is needed, which appoints and posts them. Contrary to what went on before the revolution, there is quite a long series of managers who will no longer be nominated, elected by the lower echelons, but who will inevitably be appointed from above. And these are practices which become normal. It's a militarization of the party, which will be perpetuated at the end of the war in the hierarchy which Trotsky calls the hierarchy of secretaries. It's an emerging apparatus which exists simply to hold on to and preserve its own power.
To support the war effort, Lenin introduced a policy of war communism. The party requisitioned grain from the peasants to whom they had distributed the land. It was used to feed the armies and the towns. There was no more land, bread, and freedom. Instead, there was famine and repression. It was a bloody and savage conflict. Hatred ran deep. The Red and the White armies slaughtered one another, and on both sides there were summary executions. In May 1921, sailors at the naval base of Kronstadt in the Baltic mutinied. Under a cry of "Down with Bolshevik tyranny," they demanded an end to war communism and a return to the original ideals of the revolution. Trotsky, with the agreement of the other Bolshevik leaders, gave the orders to storm the fortress manned by those he had once called the pride and glory of the revolution. In the ensuing battle, March the 21st, 1921, 30,000 Russians were killed. Trotsky's reputation was inevitably spattered with the blood from this savage repression.
Trotsky said, I believe, to the 10th Congress, "We have ruined Russia to fight the whites." It's a very revealing way of putting it. They had to raise an army of 5 million. They had to feed, clothe, and arm them from the resources of a country which, if it was not completely ruined by 1917, was subsequently devastated by a whole number of factors of foreign invasion, civil war. There were 15 or 16 million dead between 1914 and 1921, an industry relying on wood for fuel, an appalling famine during which cannibalism reappeared. Thus, there is a regression of stunning proportions.
At the beginning of 1920, Trotsky proposed that the peasants be given back the right to buy and sell their land. The Politburo rejected the proposal. But a year later, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, which took up Trotsky's plan for reconciliation with the peasants. Trotsky was the first party leader to realize that the country needed an agricultural surplus to provide funds for industrialization. In 1922, Trotsky was given the task of reorganizing transport and the economy. He was at the height of his fame. Some people reproached him for his lack of sociability, for being rather distant, and for not using the familiar form of address which was currently fashionable. Trotsky seemed elitist to his less educated comrades, and he criticized their uncouth behavior. In spite of bad health, he continued to keep very busy. This left him little time for his family life. Natalia, for her part, participated actively in the promotion of the arts. Their two sons were members of the communist youth movement. His two daughters from his previous marriage were also politically active, like their mother. In Europe, the trade unions and many socialist parties were sympathetic towards the isolation of Soviet Russia. The Bolsheviks sought to build on this support. With the aim of promoting revolution in other countries, delegations from world socialist parties met in Moscow in 1921 at the Third Congress of the Communist International, the Comintern. Trotsky was its organizer and wrote its manifesto. Its purpose was to coordinate the movement towards the ultimate goal of worldwide revolution. Lenin and Trotsky worked together to establish the Comintern as the forum for international communism. Trotsky was particularly concerned about the situation in Germany. In 1919, the Social Democrats had used the army to crush a communist uprising. Its leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, had been murdered. In 1923, the German Communist Party attempted to stage another insurrection, but this too failed. This was a defeat from which the German communists never recovered. In Munich, the fascists began their rise to power.
After the fiasco of 1923, it was obvious that the revolution in Russia would be isolated for a long time to come. It had to survive, therefore. It had to hang on. And it's at this point that Stalin came up with the idea of socialism in one country, and it's also at this point that there arose the problem of the degeneration of an isolated revolution in a poor and backward country.
Lenin had been weakened by an attack on his life, and he had his first stroke in 1922. He and Trotsky continued to have their disagreements, but they remained close. Lenin suggested that they should form a pact to check the increasing power of the bureaucracy inside the party. Trotsky was one of the most knowledgeable members of the Politburo. He was constantly being consulted for advice. He rarely stopped writing, but when he spoke, others listened. None listened or watched so carefully as Joseph Stalin. He had become party secretary in 1922, but was biding his time. Despite Stalin's caution, an apprehensive Lenin noted, "Stalin has accumulated much power. I am not sure he will use it wisely." While Trotsky enjoyed Lenin's confidence, Stalin used his power of appointment to bring the apparatus of the state and party more and more under his control. For the first time in November 1922, Lenin was absent from the revolution anniversary ceremonies. Trotsky noted carefully the perils that threatened the party. The party must return to collective leadership and to the right of free and comradely discussion. It is necessary to renew the structure and to recall that it is only the executor of the collective will. But Trotsky hesitated to enter the struggle alone without the support of Lenin, who was sick and resting far from Moscow with his wife Krupskaya. Lenin died in January 1924. In his testament, he recognized that his successor would be either Trotsky or Stalin, but he had reservations about both. Trotsky, unlike Stalin, was not a skillful political operator, and Trotsky was so sure of his position that at first he did not recognize Stalin as a serious rival. Trotsky did not return to Moscow for Lenin's funeral, and Stalin stole the limelight as chief mourner.
Trotsky says somewhere, in reply to the reproaches made to him, that he had the means to bring off a military coup since he was the head of the Red Army, though of course it's not enough to be the political head of an army in order to overthrow the government. And he replies that if I had done that, I would have had to represent the interests of those with whom I had taken power. Because, of course, the vanguard of the bureaucracy was precisely the military, which was not only best placed for accumulating great privileges, but which showed a remarkable capacity and a great avidity during the history of the Soviet Union for profiting from the peace and enjoying the good life such as it was. A coup relying on the military, even if they had a great deal of admiration for Trotsky's talents as a strategist and an organizer, would not make any social sense. It would have been a farcical adventure. Trotsky chose not to be a Bonapartist, and it is pointless to reproach him for not being a Napoleon.
In 1925, Trotsky was forced to resign as war commissar and was transferred to the directorship of a technical organization. Stalin isolated him at the Politburo, and on the 10th anniversary of October, he was expelled from the Communist Party. In January 1928, the secret police kidnapped Trotsky and took him to Soviet Central Asia with his wife Natalia and his son Lyova. He was stripped of his nationality and deported to Turkey on January the 22nd, 1929.
Stalin a commis une erreur dont il a su.
Stalin made a mistake which he later knew was a mistake and for which he never forgave himself. He exiled Trotsky. That was Stalin's greatest mistake. He thought that, well, it was too early to kill Trotsky. He couldn't. Conditions in the Soviet leadership would not allow it yet. But he could have executed Trotsky a few years later, as he executed all the others. But he was afraid that Trotsky, even if he was isolated, would be a pole of attraction for an opposition which would retain its vigor.
Un pôle d'attraction pour une opposition qui demeurerait une opposition vivante.
That's why he thought that if he exiled Trotsky from the Soviet Union and sent him abroad, he would isolate him.
En l'envoyant à l'étranger, il l'isolait.
That was his greatest mistake. I don't think he ever forgave himself for it. It explains why he was constantly seeking to kill him.
Chercher à le tuer.
With Trotsky banned, the enemy was out of the way. But for Stalin, this wasn't enough. Trotsky, the hero of 1905, organizer of the October Revolution, head of the Red Army, companion to Lenin, leader of the leftist opposition, first isolated, then deported and exiled, was to be the victim of one of the most astounding falsifications in history. The image of Trotsky had to be completely erased from the collective memory. Films, negatives, paintings, writings were methodically destroyed, erased and touched up. The Stalinist vision of history passed through the darkroom. The odor of acetone foretold the smell of blood. Trotsky in exile became the focal point for international communists who opposed Stalin. He kept in close correspondence with them, helped by his elder son, Leon Trotsky, and his wife, Natalia. In 1932, Trotsky was invited by students in Copenhagen to give a speech on the October Revolution. It turned out to be a stirring call to youth. He was 52 now and made a steady living writing articles and delivering speeches.
Les grands événements ont vérifié et confirmé notre attitude. Des cadres sérieux sont éduqués. Nous regardons avec confiance dans l'avenir. Aucune force ne pourra nous détacher l'avant-garde prolétarienne internationale. L'Union soviétique est notre patrie. Nous la défendrons jusqu'au bout. Les idées et les méthodes de Marx et de Lénine deviendront les idées et les méthodes internationales communistes.
Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Stalin had launched his own vision of the future. Collectivization of agriculture brought massive disruption, hardship, starvation and death to millions throughout the Soviet Union. In spite of imprisonment and deportation, there were some Bolsheviks inside the Soviet Union who kept up their opposition to Stalin, helped and encouraged by Trotsky's messages of support. From his exile in Turkey, Trotsky founded the Bulletin of the Opposition. With Sedov, he tried to unite all anti-Stalinist communists by creating a network of groups in contact with the opposition to Stalin in the Soviet Union. Trotsky's texts, articles and brochures were published in left-wing newspapers throughout the world. In January 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor of the German Reich. He banned political parties and trade unions. He organized the torture and deportation of hundreds of thousands of his political opponents to the first concentration camps. To counter the Nazi threat, Trotsky, for many months, advocated that German communists should form a united front with the trade unions and the socialist parties.
L'activité.
The activities of the German opposition and their links with Trotsky abroad are brought to an end by Hitler's victory, because Hitler's victory destroys the network of the Communist International, which provided a favorable context for Sedov's network to flourishing. Hitler's victory assures the victory of Stalin over Trotsky and his allies.
In the streets, German communists, misled by Stalin's directives, continued to attack German socialists, sometimes with the help of Nazi troops. Trotsky saw this as the end of the Moscow-dominated Third International. He gave up trying to reform it and declared, "We must build new communist parties and a new communist international."
Le nouveau développement en Allemagne donne un exemple saisissant de la politique fondamentale forte de la direction du prolétariat. Assimilation de la démocratie au fascisme, répudiation de la politique de front unique et par suite rénonciation aux soviets.
After 4.5 years' exile in Turkey, Trotsky obtained a visa to live in France. He took a secluded house at Barbizon, outside Paris. He knew that his life was in danger from Stalin and his agents, and communicated with the outside world by messenger. There were stringent security arrangements. Trotsky was warned not to engage in political activity, but he soon attracted attention. When rioting broke out in Paris, the French government became concerned about Trotsky's presence. A chorus of criticism from the right wing, protests from Moscow, and rumors of communist plots made them think again. Trotsky was told to move on. As he faced expulsion from France, the great wave of Stalinist show trials was gathering force in Moscow. August the 19th, 1936, the first trial opened in Moscow. Among the accused were Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Smirnov.
Je ne pense pas que
it was impossible to foresee the wave of terror and lies that constituted the three big trials brought by Stalin against Lenin's main associates. I don't think we could have anticipated the unbelievable confessions of men who had endured Tsarist prison, Siberia, the gallows, confessions in which they admitted to being monsters with human faces, dogs dripping with blood, that it was they who derailed trains, who sabotaged the workers' food, and who, with mercury vapors, poisoned and caused the death of Gorky, who held talks with the German High Command and the agents of the Mikado. We couldn't possibly have anticipated these completely unbelievable confessions. The first big trial hit us like a thunderbolt.
A campaign of vilification implicating Trotsky in these crimes was organized from Moscow. Trotsky's name was smeared across the pages of the French press. Stalin systematically eliminated every single one of his comrades who had fought for the revolution. Trotsky was now the sole survivor. In June 1935, he obtained a visa for Norway. Under the Soviet threat of economic retaliation, the Norwegian government kept the couple under house arrest. After 18 months, they were deported from Norway to Mexico. They reached Tampico on January the 9th, 1937, to be greeted by the Mexican artist Diego Rivera and his wife, Frida Kahlo. Trotsky had left Europe for the last time, but found in the New World a small band of loyal supporters. Their influence with Mexico's left-wing president, Lázaro Cárdenas, ensured that the Trotskys were taken to Mexico City in the president's official train. The Riveras took the Trotskys to their home, where they stayed for 2 years. He spent his time writing. American publishers and magazines paid well for his work, and he was in constant demand for interviews and audiences. Trotsky and Natalia came back to life again after their long European night. Diego Rivera arranged for a group of Mexican workers to act as bodyguards for their guests. Trotsky began preparing a detailed defense against the charges for which he had been sentenced to death in Moscow, and tried in vain to enlist the support of communists throughout the world in his denunciation of Stalin.
What is now my principal task? To reveal the truth, to show and to demonstrate that the true criminal hides under the cloak of the accuser. What will be the next step in his direction? The creation of an American, an European, and subsequent also an international commission of inquiry. composed of people who incontestably enjoy authority and public confidence. I undertake to present to such a commission all my files, thousands of personal and open letters, in which the development of my thought and my actions reflected day by day, without any gaps. I have nothing to hide.
The inquiry opened in Mexico on April the 10th, 1937. It was chaired by the veteran American philosopher John Dewey, but was notable for the absence of most of Europe's left-wing intellectuals. Trotsky gave a bravura performance, as witnessed by the American communist Al Glertzer.
There were Mexican journalists there, were journalists from the U.S. It was a tremendous occasion for us, and everybody had a feeling of elation, you know, and the hearings began, and they were sensational, actually. I was the reporter. I sat in front of Trotsky for the 8 days, in front of the commission and the lawyers, and although I didn't have much time to relax, I had enough composure to watch what was going on, to observe Trotsky as a witness. That was the most unusual thing of all. He testifies for 8 solid days of the most intense testimony you can imagine. His biography, the history of the revolution, the history of the Russian movement, the events in the revolution, the counter-revolution, the fight against Stalin, the rise of the opposition, his expulsion, his exile, his deportation, his life in Turkey, France, and Norway, and the enormous body of ideas and writings that came out of the struggle against Stalinism.
These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism. That is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people.
The Commission's verdict was very clear and definitive. It said that the charges against the Trotskys were false and the Moscow trials were frame-ups.
Despite its verdict, the commission itself was a bitter disappointment to Trotsky. Its findings were largely ignored, both in the United States and in a Europe preoccupied with the Spanish Civil War and the growing menace of Hitler's Germany. But personal tragedy overshadowed all else in early 1938. In February, his eldest son, Leon Trotsky, died in a Paris clinic after an appendicitis operation. His collaborator, Zborovsky, known as Stephen, was revealed to be a member of Stalin's secret police. His other son, Sergei, disappeared into the Lubyanka jail in Moscow.
Lyova, le fils aîné, vous le savez, est mort d'une façon...
Lyova, his elder son, died in a mysterious way. It's probable that Stalin's secret police were involved in some way. It was for Trotsky and Natalia a terrible sorrow, but it was in a certain sense in the order of things. He was a fighting man. He joined in their struggles. He led them, while Sergei, she said, was an innocent victim. He had no interest in politics. He was only interested in his work as an engineer. And he was arrested solely because he was the son of Trotsky. Both Trotsky and Natalia felt this very acutely, because she told me one day that after Sergei's disappearance into prison, when they got no more news of him, Trotsky had fleetingly considered committing suicide thinking that if he put an end to himself, perhaps they would free him.
Disant, si je disparaissais, peut-être le libérerait.
In Moscow, Stalin continued his private war against opponents, real and imagined. 25,000 officers were purged as he decapitated the Red Army. Hitler's armies, on the other hand, were ready for war. Trotsky knew that the two dictators would inevitably form an alliance. He tried to counter their barbarism by creating the Fourth International, the world party of the Socialist Revolution. But a year later, in 1939, Hitler and Stalin made the Nazi-Soviet pact. Having parted from Diego Rivera, Trotsky and his wife moved to a house on the Avenida Vienna in Coyoacán, a suburb of Mexico City. There, he prepared an armed bunker in response to increasingly precise threats to his life. Trotsky's only other relative, his grandson Sieva, came to stay. Sieva witnessed the first attempt on Trotsky's life on May the 24th, 1940.
I was sleeping peacefully in my room next to my grandfather's when a noise woke me up. It was someone who was pushing the door of the lattice window nearby, and the noise woke me. It was 4:30 in the morning. A moment later, the shooting started. Machine guns. The house began to reek of cordite. And the whole place smelled like a battlefield.
Trotsky escaped injury, although over 200 shots were fired. Suspicion fell on a group of Stalinists in Mexico. Arrested, they confessed to the attempt on Trotsky's life. Trotsky now took extreme precautions, especially when on the move. Soon after the machine gun attack, a newcomer was admitted to Trotsky's entourage. His name was Frank Jackson, a writer introduced to Trotsky by close communist associates. Trotsky was working on his Life of Stalin. Jackson asked Trotsky to read some of his work. It was about 5 p.m. on August the 20th, 1940, when Trotsky invited Jackson into his study. Jackson took an ice pick from underneath his raincoat and smashed it into Trotsky's skull. Trotsky fought back, but was mortally wounded. Natalia, hearing screams, found her husband standing in the window, drenched in blood. He told his wife he loved her and collapsed on the floor. Jackson was attacked and beaten by Trotsky's bodyguards. He appeared dazed as he was taken away in an ambulance. He was questioned in hospital by the Mexican police about the motive for his crime. Trotsky went into a coma a few hours after the attack. Natalia was with him until the end. In Moscow, Stalin was finally freed from his last and most persistent critic. Leon Trotsky died on August the 21st, 1940. Jackson, his assassin, identified as Ramon Mercader, one of Stalin's agents, was sentenced to 20 years in jail. Released in 1960, he was decorated in Moscow with the Order of the Red Banner. Mercader will be remembered only for killing Trotsky. But Trotsky will be remembered as the most celebrated victim of Stalin, who was handed the dreams of the Bolsheviks only to turn them into a nightmare many believed might last forever. In exile, months before his death, Leon Trotsky had remembered the dream. My faith in the communist future of humanity is as ardent as ever. It is, if anything, stronger today than when I was young. Natalia has just come up to the window from the courtyard and opened it wider so that the air may enter more freely into my room. I can see the bright green strip of grass beneath the wall, and the clear blue sky above, and the bright sunlight everywhere. Life is beautiful. May future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full.